Nabal was Abigail's husband, who became known in the Bible because he was an inconsequential man. Nabal's story is recorded in the Bible in Samuel's first book in the Old Testament. And in this video, you will understand everything the Bible says about who was Nabal. Nabal was a rich farmer, descendant of Caleb, who lived in southeastern Hebron. He lived in a city named Mam, and apart from his flocks on the border of Judah. Nabal appears in the Bible at the time David and his 600 men sought refuge in those lands in the context of King Saul's persecution against David. And according to the biblical text, while David and his men were in that region, they protected Nabal's herds against desert robbers, and still maintained good relations with the shepherds who worked there. Then, at the time of the sheep, David sent 10 of his men to Nabal, seeking some bonus for the protection provided to his pastors. That gratification would be very important to David's conditions at that time, as he needed provisions for his men. But despite all the cordiality of David's servants, Nabal behaved very rudely. He claimed that he did not know who David was, and even implied that David was just a slave who had fled his lord. Then Nabal refused to give David and his men any help, and this is where the Bible makes it clear that Nabal was a crazy man. But on the other hand, his wife was a prudent woman. The sequence of the biblical narrative tells this story by recording that when David learned what Nabal had done, he took 400 from his armed men and left to attack him. And it was then that some of Nabal's employees told Abigail, Nabal's wife, everything that was happening. Abigail was a beautiful and intelligent woman. In fact, the text of Samuel's first book in chapter 25, verse 3, makes a contrast between Nabal and Abigail as follows. His name was Nabal and his wife's name was Abigail, a smart and beautiful woman, but her husband, descendant of Caleb, was rude and bad. Upon learning that David had gathered his men to destroy Nabal, Abigail quickly strived to avoid the approaching catastrophe. She prepared a large amount of provisions on her own and sent a peace offer to David. She personally went to meet David without warning her husband. And when Abigail saw David, she got out of her donkey and filed a mercy. She appealed to David's piety and even told him that God was with him and would certainly give him a very prosperous kingdom. And for all this, there was no need for him to pour out blood seeking to do justice with his own hands. Then, in front of Abigail's request, David decided to cancel the attack. He acknowledged that God had sent that woman to meet him, so that he would not stain with Nabal's blood. David, too, he praised Abigail's common sense, as we read in Samuel's first book in chapter 25, between verses 32 and 35. And when Abigail returned home, she found Nabal participating in a large banquet. But since he was very drunk, prudent Abigail said nothing to him. Already the other day, in the morning, when Nabal was sober, Abigail told him everything that had happened. Then the Bible says, Nabal suffered an attack and was paralyzed like a stone. Scholars indicate that perhaps Nabal has suffered a heart attack, or perhaps a stroke, or perhaps a congestion collapse. In any case, Nabal stayed in this situation for 10 days until the Lord injured him and he died. About this, the biblical text says, in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. He suffered an attack and was paralyzed like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord injured Nabal and he died. Upon learning of Nabal's death, David understood that it had been an act of God that prevented him from practicing revenge with his own hands. David knew that Nabal had treated him with injustice, but the judge of all the land was attentive to what happened and returned to Nabal according to the measure of his own wickedness. Then David proposed to the widow Abigail in marriage, and this story of Nabal, marked by his bad example, serves as a reminder to all readers of the Bible. Nabal was a bad and irreducible man. According to verse 17 of chapter 25 of Samuel's first book, the biblical text indicates that no one could even talk to Nabal. And curiously, this name, Nabal in Hebrew, is a word for crazy. And over it, the interpreters say that the meaning of the name Nabal conveys the meaning of a void that expresses the madness of inner wickedness. So it is possible to understand that this man was a true personification of madness. However, Nabal did not act the way he acted for pure foolishness, but because he was insensitive and cruel. Nabal had no consideration for ethical or religious issues. The biblical text makes it clear that not even his wife could count on him. And all of this means that Nabal was a spiritually crazy man. The psalmist in Psalm 14 talked about this kind of person when in the first verse he wrote, People of the same kind of Nabal live as if God did not exist, live as if they will never have to account for someone. In addition, Nabal also fits perfectly with the profile described by the prophet Isaiah when he said, "The madman speaks madly, and his heart practices iniquity to use hypocrisy and to make mistakes against the Lord, and to leave the soul of the hungry, and to make it empty, and to make the thirsty lack of drink, and to make the thirsty lack of drink." In other words, Nabal was that kind of man who worried only about himself and his own riches. And if you liked this video, leave your comments saying if you already knew Nabal's story at Bible. And if you want to study the Bible clearly, objectively, and organized, you can study theology with us. The information is in the video description or in the first fixed comment.